coverage of it was headlined, U.S. government says inability to censor you causes it irreparable harm. And you're talking about, I think we're talking about the same case, which was basically a lawsuit brought by, in part by our friend Janine Eunice, who we used to interview a lot, challenging the government for pressuring social media companies into silencing critical voices. Are we talking about the same case, Ben?
We are.
Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about that? Because we've heard of that case. We haven't had Janine Eunice on. I'm not sure if she's available anymore because she's no longer with the new Civil Liberties Alliance, which was like a civil liberties law firm. She has actually gone to work in the Congress on a government committee against the weaponization of the state, which is just incredible. I'm so glad she's there. But I think that means we can't chat with her about things in the same way as we did before. But why don't you tell us a little bit about the case? Janine told us about the case as it was filed. She told us that it had a certain focus, especially on the pandemic. But maybe you can tell us about the ruling, because we haven't had a full briefing on that yet. Tell me what the court said, how it said it, and how quickly it enforced it. There were some wonderful parts about it, and I don't think it's got enough news up here in Canada.
Yeah, so first of all, the context for this case, which I would describe as maybe the landmark digital free speech case to date, a historic one potentially, and one that may ultimately end up at the Supreme Court here. This case, Missouri v. Biden, was brought by multiple state attorneys general. They were joined by some of the key signatories to and brains behind the Great Barrington Declaration, and then some groups, one conservative media outlet and then another anti sort of draconian COVID regulation organization. And basically what they alleged was that the government, in tandem with, and when I say the government, I really mean almost the entirety of the federal government, in tandem with certain putatively academic/research organizations that bill themselves as anti-disinformation outfits, but in reality serve as government surveillance and censorship cutouts, coerced, cajoled, and ultimately colluded successfully with the social media platforms to surveil and ultimately censor en masse Americans and non-Americans' tweets, Facebook posts, etc. And what they revealed in just the discovery in this case, which led up to this initial ruling from the judge, revealed the greatest censorship regime arguably in the history of mankind. And that is sort of how the judge himself described it, in saying that if what the plaintiffs allege is accurate, and he, by the way, in this ruling, which I'll get to in a moment, says that they are likely to prevail on the merits of their case, that this has been a massive First Amendment violation by government authorities. So what exactly did that regime entail? And this is laid out in massive court filings, which have more than enough smoking guns, if we had a real media, for people to win Pulitzers over, but they don't cover it. And they say this is a nothing burger. At least they did until this ruling came down. What this shows is a coordinated effort led by the national security and public health apparatus to, again, work with, and in some cases, help foster the creation of these third-party cutouts at prestigious institutions like Stanford University, for example, to work with the social media companies to essentially identify specific stories, entire narratives, accounts, individual pieces of content, show them that those ought to constitute violations of terms of service, hoover up en masse these examples of putatively offending content that constitutes quote unquote mis, dis, and malinformation, and then feed it to the social media companies and tell them, kill these accounts, undermine these narratives, silence en masse, effectively millions of Americans, prevent people not only from speaking, but from listening. And the evidence in this case is overwhelming and unbelievable. And again, it's only based on preliminary, limited discovery. That discovery has included depositions from many of the government agents who led this effort to go about censoring wrongthink. And this goes to a broader worldview that we've talked about before, which the government has effectively codified through this public-private censorship regime of saying wrongthink, ideas, opinions, and not just opinions, but inconvenient facts that we don't like or that conflict with our favored narratives, threaten national security, or will get people killed because they won't be vaccinated. And consequently, that gives us a right to push the social media companies to engage in quote unquote content moderation. This started all with the idea that there was foreign influence operations using social media to undermine democracy, quickly turned to domestic wrong thinkers, and it exploded in a few different realms. First with the Hunter Biden laptop story, the infamous Hunter Biden laptop story, which in and of itself constituted maybe the gravest American national security information operation in American history on the eve of an election. Election interference, effectively, in grooming the social media companies to censor that story, which is part of this case. Then it moved to election integrity and outcomes. You're not allowed to question mass mail-in balloting. You're not allowed to question irregularities, historically, outcomes that you've never seen before, et cetera. And then expanding to virtually every aspect of COVID-19, from its origins to mitigation techniques, draconian lockdowns, and then to a whole slew of other issues. And you had federal authorities, again, working hand in hand with the White House, who was publicly and privately using its bullhorns to yell at, essentially, the social media companies. You got to do something about this dis, and malinformation that's killing people. On top of lawmakers who threaten, obviously, with legislation and regulatory remedies, pursuing the big tech companies, and then these third-party cutouts as well. So it was a concerted effort. It led to probably hundreds of millions, if not more, of pieces of content being censored. This case exposed it all. So for those who think that the Twitter files were revealing, I urge you to check out the case docket in Missouri v. Biden, and specifically this ruling that this Judge Doty put forth. Now, to that ruling, with that long-winded wind-up for it, what the judge said was, again, the plaintiffs are likely to prevail on the merits that this was a massive First Amendment violation that took place. And what he did was he issued a preliminary injunction freezing government speech policing directly and by proxy, said that all manner of defendants, again, myriad government agencies, the White House, and basically prevented them from continuing to communicate with social media companies about wrongthink. Overwhelmingly, of course, they targeted conservatives in the wrongthink censorship operation, as well as even coordinating and colluding with their third-party private, quote-unquote, cutouts, private cutouts who often themselves had incestuous relations with the government agencies and, again, consulted with them in the creation of these outside, quote-unquote, anti-disinformation organizations. So the judge said, we are freezing federal government-led speech policing. And this led to, of course, two responses from the government. One was to appeal the injunction, and that appeal is pending right now. The other was to seek a stay, freezing the freeze of the speech police. And that freezing of the stay prompted this piece that I wrote, which argues essentially that what the government is saying in seeking to freeze this injunction is they want to keep violating your First Amendment. They believe that what they did was not impose the greatest censorship regime in world history, arguably, but that they ought to be able to continue doing it, and that actually, and this is a legal term of art, but I think it should be understood plainly, that it causes the government irreparable harm for the First Amendment to be defended, because it could lead to threats to, in the government's word, democracy, and therefore irreparable harm to the government. So the government is essentially unrepentant in its censorship. It sought to freeze the freezing of this censorship regime, and thankfully, Judge Doty smacked the government down and denied their motion for a stay. And so that injunction is in place right now. We know this in part because FBI Director Christopher Wray, testifying before the House Judiciary Committee, himself noted that his agency had issued guidance for complying with that injunction. Now, I'd really like to see what that guidance looks like. I think every agency implicated in this lawsuit ought to show us what the guidance looks like and how they're complying with it. But nevertheless, this is a massive victory for free speech in America and really free speech in the world when you're talking about these platforms, which, of course, have customers that are everywhere on the planet.